of the company, and there are other legal persons also. Now, to assume assessee to be the beneficial owner was a mere assumption of the department, and therefore, for that reason, the assessee argued that the reasons to believe were invalid stroke incorrect, and therefore on that basis the proceedings were void ab initio. Secondly, the assessee argued that on the basis of passports it is clear that assessee was non-resident in India, and the department has proceeded on the basis that she was resident in that year. Now, when on subsequent pointing out of that fact that she was non-resident, therefore for that reason again the reopening proceedings gets vitiated, and therefore they needs to be dropped, because when the assessee is found to be non-resident, then there is no income escaping assessment, reasons to believe become incorrect, and therefore the reopening proceedings can be quashed. And lastly, the assessee argued that since it was only on the basis of base note, no further verification was conducted by the assessing officer post receipt of that base note, and 148 notice was issued. The proceedings were initiated on the basis of reasons to suspect, and there was no valid reason to believe of the assessee income escaping assessment, and therefore for all these three reasons, the assessee attacked the initiation of reassessment proceedings. That was the first limb of his argument. Then he moved forward on the merits of the matter. On the merits, obviously, the first plea of the assessee was that she was not the owner of the bank account, and there was no evidence with the department to suggest that she was the owner of the bank account. As per the letter, the owner was the Cayman Island company, which also matched with the detail in the base note, which described the customer as that Cayman Island company. And then he said that due regard must be given to the letters from the HSBC when the department itself is relying on the leaked information from the HSBC bank, which is just the base note. In the same breath, the revenue should also consider the confirmatory value of the letters received from the HSBC bank, where they have described the clear structure of the entire transaction. And as much as the assessee is not the owner of the bank account, and she is ultimately only the discretionary beneficiary of the trust. And last, with respect to the issue of discretionary beneficiary, the assessee relied upon this decision of Supreme Court in the case of HMM Vikram Singh Ji Gonde, wherein it was held that the beneficiary, in case of a discretionary trust, income becomes taxable in the hands of beneficiary in case of a discretionary beneficiary when that income is distributed by the trust to the beneficiary. In the present case, since no such distribution had happened in the relevant year, and in any case the trust has been wound and no money has flown back to the assessee, no income in any case could be brought to tax in the hands of assessee. So for these reasons, he attacked the addition made on the merits of the matter. And lastly, she reiterated that since on the basis of peak credit, possibly the relevant provision that could be applied in this case is section 69A, which deems income, undisclosed money, to be income of the year in which money is found. So in this case, since the money was found in the relevant assessment year, that is 2006-07, in that year, since she was non-resident, this income could not have been brought to tax in India. So on without prejudice basis, on alternate basis, the assessee again argued that this income cannot in any case be brought to tax in the hands of assessee. And with respect to the other aspect of consent waiver form, the assessee reiterated that since she was not the owner of the bank account, she was right in denying to sign the consent waiver form, and that could not have been viewed adversely. The department had relied upon the decision of Bombay High Court in the case of Sohini Kothari, wherein again there were observations of the High Court that if consent waiver form is not signed, it shows that there is something fishy behind the transaction, and therefore the assessee is denying to sign the consent form. The assessee sought to distinguish that decision on the basis that it was a case of writ petition where the High Court had dismissed the writ petition on the ground of alternate remedy without opining anything on the merits of the matter, and therefore these observations cannot be used while deciding the fate of the assessee's matter on merits. So for all these reasons, the assessee tried to defend the addition made by the lower authorities. Now we come to the findings of the ITAT. Now the first issue was with respect to the reopening of the assessment. The ITAT upheld the validity of reopening of the assessment. With respect to the first issue of reasons to believe being invalid or incorrect, the tribunal noted that no, at the stage of recording the reasons, the assessing officer has to only form a prima facie belief, and it should not be 100%. He should not have a 100% view that the income has escaped assessment, and therefore this base note constituted a credible information in the possession of the assessing officer to form the reason to believe of income escaping assessment, and therefore there was no invalidity in assuming the jurisdiction under section 147. That was first. And with respect to the second plea of the assessee being non-resident, the ITAT denied the same on the ground that when the assessee herself in the original return of income, as also in the return filed in response to notice under section 148, has declared herself to be the resident in, then the onus cannot be shifted to the assessing officer to say that the reasons to believe recorded at that point of time were incorrect, and therefore there is no fallout of the assessee subsequently pointing out her to be non-resident in India in that year, and therefore the reasons to believe were valid. 148 notice issued was valid, and therefore jurisdiction was rightly assumed. So on that basis, tribunal upheld the jurisdiction under section 147. This was the first aspect of the order. Now on the merits of the matter, the tribunal found that there is a stalemate with regard to evidence between the assessee and the revenue. The revenue is only in the possession of the base note, and the assessee has not cooperated the department in gathering further evidence by not signing the consent waiver form, while the assessee on the one hand can bring the letters from the HSBC bank, but she is not able to bring on record the trust deed or the further details of the Cayman Island company. And therefore the tribunal observed that the assessee has herself not cooperated in bringing the evidence on record. In such a situation, the tribunal observed that we cannot put blinkers on our eyes and decide the case against the revenue on the ground that they have not discharged the onus. In such a situation, the tribunal observed that we can bring in section 114, which talks about circumstantial evidence, and therefore in such a situation the matter can be decided where there is no evidence coming on record either from the revenue side or from the assessee side. The issue can be decided on the basis of circumstantial evidence, and they, while observing that, they completely disregarded the letters brought on record by the HSBC bank on the ground that they do not have evidentiary value. They have been written by HSBC bank not to the department but to the director of that company. How those letters have come on record, they say they don't want to take cognizance of those letters, and therefore they were completely disregarded. When they were completely disregarded, they moved on the basis of the reading of the entire matter that was borne out from the base note. So on that basis, they proceeded to decide the matter, read with the circumstantial evidence surrounding the entire facts of the case. Now, the circumstantial evidence which they noted was as follows. The first, they read the base note. They said that in the base note, the name of the assessee is appearing as the beneficial owner of the bank account. Therefore, this was the first circumstance that was against the assessee. There was no trust deed on record to demonstrate who was the settler of the trust, whether or not the assessee was herself the settler of the trust, whether she was the sole beneficiary, whether or not she was the discretionary beneficiary. Since they disregarded the letter and there was no trust deed on record, they viewed it adversely and said that they cannot believe that she was the discretionary beneficiary of the trust. That was the second instance. Third, they said that the fact that account was closed, the bank account was closed and the trust was wound up just before when the information was leaked and the proceedings were initiated by Government of India, itself shows that there is something fishy about the entire transaction, that in such a short span of time, the account was closed and the money was dispersed and there is no information of the trust or the Cayman Island company coming to the record of the Government of India. That was the third instance which the tribunal noted. The fourth, they went into the history of the Cayman Island entities. They noted that the Cayman Islands is infamous for incorporating shell companies where the companies are operated by the promoters to park their wealth in those companies without actual business operations of these companies. So they observed that Cayman Island companies are known publicly that they are to facilitate financial maneuvering for the benefits of clients, and therefore this fact that the bank account belonged to a Cayman Island was also to be viewed against the assessee as a circumstantial evidence against the assessee. And then fifth, again, I pointed out the company was also dissolved after the closure of the bank account. Third, they noted, they did a Google research and found about the trust structures that were sold by the HSBC Bank. From the website, they noted that the bank publicizes that we have professional structures in place where the high net worth individuals can create the trust, settle their funds in those trusts, and and those trusts can be for the benefit of their family members, or they can themselves become the beneficiaries in those trusts, and the bank will manage those funds as the trustee of those trusts. So on that basis, they said that this HSBC it's herself publicizes this trust structure to park the.
गौरव
Yes,
ना,
yes.
ऊपर ऑप्शन होती है एनोटेशन बंद करने के लिए, तो ये एनोटेशन कर रहे हैं कोई लोग जो आ रहे हैं इसके ऊपर। तो
Okay,
आप अगर स्क्रीन शेयर पे जाओगे ना तो एनोटेशन की है कि बाय अदर्स बाय माई सेल्फ ऐसे लिखा होगा कुछ। स्क्रीन शेयर के ऊपर राइट साइड व्यू ऑप्शन देखो, वैसे अब हट गया है बट देख लेना।
All right, all right. So on that basis, also on the basis of the publication by HSBC on the website, they again viewed the entire situation as against the assessee. And then with respect to the residential status, the tribunal noted that assessee had moved to USA just 7 days before the close of the relevant financial year, and in a span of 1 year, she had collected 200 crores of peak credit in just 1 year, whereas she is filing the return of income of only 1 lakh in India. And they noted that this is again going against the normal human probability that she would be able to collect so much of donation in 1 year. She is not. The tribunal noted that assessee is not world famous like Mother Teresa to have collected so much of funds in a short span of time. So the fact that she has collected so much of funds in a short span of time and becoming a discretionary beneficiary of such funds also can be viewed against the assessee as against the human probability. So on that basis, the tribunal disregards the existence of trust, disregards the letters, disregards the affidavit filed by the assessee, and considers the assessee to be, and also disregards the assessee to be the discretionary beneficiary of the trust, because when they disregard the trust, they also do not consider her to be the discretionary beneficiary of the trust. They consider her to be the beneficiary of the company, and since the money belonged to the company, they held that yes, this money was the income of the assessee, and therefore they upheld the addition of income made by the assessing officer in the assessment order. They completely accepted the assessment order. So these are the various fact pattern, which is a little complicated fact pattern involved in the case, and the various ratios laid down by the tribunal. Now this decision now throws upon many questions as to whether the decision on the validity of assumption of jurisdiction under section 147 is correct, or on the merits of the matter, more particularly with respect to the test of onus, whether the assessee was correct to have discharged onus by way of filing the affidavit, filing the letters, or what was the onus on the assessing officer, whether the matter could have been decided against the assessee on the basis of the test of human probability and the circumstantial evidence. So with that background, we can now come forward to questions. I'll be posing, I've framed certain questions that are arising. I think my panelists will be more seasoned to rake up more pertinent questions, but I'll start with the first question that I have raised. I'll pose the question and then I'll ask my panelists to join. The first question that I'm pointing out is whether on the basis of base note, which only contained the details of the persons of certain information of the persons who had opened the bank account, which was also not clear. It on the one hand mentioned Cayman Island Company as the owner of the bank account, and on the other hand, it also showed the name of the person. Whether on the basis of base note, the assessing officer was right in forming the reason to believe that income of the assessee had escaped assessment, or it was only a reason to suspect. The assessing, or whether assessing officer should have conducted some more inquiry after receiving that base note and before issuing the notice under section 148 or assuming jurisdiction under 147 to tax that amount in the hands of the assessee. So this is my first question, and I'll ask Mr. Vadva to please come in and take up this first question.
Thank you very much, Gaurav. Can I request you to just come to the reasons to believe that you have in your slides?
Sure.
So that, because that's what we are going to be analyzing now. And so I think it is your number 2 slide, number 3, right? Now, you just mentioned, Gaurav, that the base note was also annexed with the reasons to believe, and therefore perhaps formed a part of that. Somehow I have not been able to locate that finding where they say it has been appended. But assuming, for the sake of argument, that it was appended, let's just take a look at the reasons to believe. Now, the reasons to believe, you will see, make no reference to the base note. They also do not make any reference to any annexure, any enclosure. And this is the reason to believe, which is also there at page 2 of the ITAT order, where there is one more line which says, in light of this, notice under section 148 of the Act is issued, meaning thereby that there is nothing more than what you have stated. Now, here, if you see, before I just go into this, just a few basics of the reason to believe. Some facts which are settled facts. I won't go into the judgments, but the settled facts are, settled legal issues are, that reopening is an extraordinary power which seeks to unsettle the settled position, and therefore has to be applied with a lot of circumspection and care. Then the reasons to believe have to be self-explanatory on a standalone basis. They have to be tested on a standalone basis. They cannot be supplanted. They cannot be supplemented. They cannot be modified. They cannot be improved upon. Then, if the reasons to believe make a reference to another document, it should also be enclosed. It doesn't make a reference. And you cannot obviously add to the reasons to believe. Then there's also what you very rightly said, prior to reopening, and also in the reasons to believe, there must be a reflection of the application of the mind of the assessing officer as to the material which he has, and thereafter he should seek to link it with the escapement of income. It should not look something like a borrowed satisfaction. It should not also feel to a very normal common man that the reopening is being effected on the basis of suspicion, to make further inquiries, to make further probing. Now, having said this, let us look at the reasons to believe. Now, the reasons to believe state that the information was received from the Office of the DIT Investigation, Bangalore, stating that the assessee is having a bank account with the HSBC account, Geneva, bearing a number such and such. So the information is from the DIT investigation. It doesn't talk of information having been received from the government of France under the double taxation avoidance agreement or whatever. It doesn't say so. It simply says information has been received from the DIT investigation. The source is not given. There is no also reference to the base note. Then they say that the assessee is having a bank account with the HSBC account, meaning thereby that the assessee in the individual capacity. If you look at clause 2, also it comes out, transpires that what they are saying, what is being alleged is that the assessee has a bank account in her individual capacity. Now, Gaurav, for the sake of argument, even if the base note was something which was to be relied upon, the base note doesn't say that the assessee is an individual having an account by herself. Look at this. Where does it say that the account belongs to the assessee? Now, we can go back to that. We can go back to your reasons. So let's also read number 2. From the bank statement, it is seen that assessee is having a peak balance of USD such and the said account during the previous year. So there are now 2 assertions. 3. 1, DIT investigation. 2, it is the assessee who has the bank account. And 3, that the bank account is perhaps with the department. If you look at from the bank statement, it is seen. That means they have seen the bank statement. Then the records of this office show that this amount has not been considered by the assessee in a return of income, and this income therefore has escaped. So the presumption is that there is a peak balance, and the peak balance has not been shown. Now, the assumption is that the peak balance, the bank balance, let us assume that the assessee is a resident, which it is. Now, merely if the resident has a bank balance, does it mean it is an income? And let us say if it was a loan, then, so here also I feel, if I'm just reading this and then I'll come to your specific questions. These are just throwing some issues. Where is the relationship of the income and the escapement? You can interject whenever you want me to keep quiet and put it on to the others, please say so. Then they say this evidence has come. So these are the 4 or 5 facts which are coming out of this. Now your question that whether the base note can form the reasons to believe. Firstly, I am disputing that the base note is not there. It's not been discussed. My contention is that they have simply relied upon the information for the DIT investigation. Even if assuming for the sake of argument, the base note is an attachment, the AO has not placed any reliance on the base note in the reasons to believe. He has not analyzed it. He has made no reference to it. He has not even picked up anything in the base note. This reason is completely divorced from the base note. And therefore, it is simply an information received from the DIT investigation where he has failed to apply his mind. This information can at best constitute borrowed satisfaction or suspicion. He has carried out no examination himself. And therefore, on the first issue, I'm not coming to the next issue. On the first issue to your question, no, the material on the basis of which he has reopened the assessment is insufficient. It is something which can at best arouse suspicion or it provides a lead, and there is no prima facie application of his mind to get into what the investigation officer has as to its veracity, its content, and its linkage.
So Ajay-ji, I think you have answered my question in the sense in favor of the assessee by saying that there are 3 issues emerging from the reasons recorded. The first is, yes, it is purely based on suspicion without any valid reason to believe that this money belonged to assessee and had escaped assessment for multiple reasons which you pointed out. And second, that this is simply on the basis of dictates of the report received from the DIT investigation without independent application of mind. And third, the reason to believe is per se incorrect. In fact, that was my third question, which we are taking up right now itself, that the reason to believe was incorrect in the sense that while the information with the revenue was the base note, but they recorded in the reasons to believe as bank account. So on these 3 grounds, your submission is that the reasons to believe are incorrect, which needs to be quashed at the threshold. Now, since you have raised your points, let us see what are the what could be the contentions from the opposite side, from the revenue side, and who best can be there not to answer it is Mr. Srivastav. I think I can call in Mr. Srivastav to give his viewpoint on this aspect of the matter.
Unmute kariye Srivastav.
So, Gaurav, thank you. I believe for this any discussion on a case of this nature, allow me for a couple of minutes to just express myself on some broader issues of rather than we'll come to these specifics of the reasons for you. When I begin, and I get that thread from my friend Mr. Ajay Vora, he mentioned the change in the approach of the judiciary. I recall in one of the chamber meetings in a couple of years back, I think it was PhD chamber or somewhere, one of the persons from the audience, he asked me that how come that the judges are reversing, going back on their own decisions, very well written decisions, well argued and well completed. The instant reply that I could give was only this, that look, I mean, times are so changing that earlier at in judicial forum, what we used to get is that a statement of fact is made out. The counsels used to use their best of their skills to convince their point of view, and the judges would listen to both sides and then come to a finding. And their finding was based on what really happened before them by way of arguments or submissions by those opposing counsels. Now, with the so much of exposure of media and the scams and the facts of many things say this scam or that kind of evasion or this systematic evasion, particularly those systematic evasion, avoidance or evasion, those being discussed at various forums and everybody getting so much knowledge about what is actually happening, then judges also have that knowledge beforehand. And if they have that knowledge, then obviously they will test the submissions based on that knowledge that they already have. So therefore, question is this, that should the substantial justice, now a broader question, would depend on some certain technicalities, that what kind of, whether it is bank statement or it is base statement. No, it was not a bank statement, it was only a base statement. Or since he has not written that I have examined and there is income has escaped assessment, is it really non-application of mind? Yes, we do succeed in courts on these technical aspects, but should the cause of substantial justice really be suffering by these technical issues when the substance of the matter speaks differently? And now see how the tribunal has approached this issue. Now the tribunal takes note of the entire background and the source of information. It goes into how that employee, that bank employee, how he collected the information and left, how he went to France, how he passed on the information, how the information came, all that was, and how the information came to the government of India. So completely analyzing, I mean, here the judge knows the very source of information, what it was contained and what was publicly discussed and debated all these years about this Swiss bank accounts. He also takes note of the fact that the bankers themselves were party to this kind of tax evasion. They were offering services of various kinds, including creation of trusts, management of trust, and all that. Now, so kindly see, as far as coming to the reopening part, I think the author of the judgment was fully conscious of these aspects and therefore
Gaurav, I think
Yes.
here's the line.
Yeah, I think there's a network issue.
Yeah.
He must be rejoining.
Meanwhile, I thought just the point, just what I'm trying to suggest is, Srivastav Saab is very right when it comes to that. But I thought our issue in question at this point of time is the reason to believe on a standalone basis.
Yeah.
So what perhaps he is going into is the merits of the
Merits
case,
of the
circumstantial evidence and all that, and what led to that decision. So I thought, let's look at only, if you could interject and tell him that, anyway, now since he's not here, probably you'll have to go to Mr. Vora.
Yes.
But on a reason to believe on a standalone basis, based on the settled principles, let us look at that.
So I think, can I call in Mr. Vora to have his view on the technical aspect of the matter, on the reasons to believe and validity of notice under section 148?
Thank you, Gaurav. And I see the aggression in the arguments of a learned president, a young, passionate, willing to defend his client. And on the other side is a seasoned tax administrator, now also representing assessees in their respective matters. My reaction will, even on the reopening, is a little tempered in the sense that while I do not dispute whatever has been said by Ajay Wadhwa, that reason to believe, this law is well settled, reason to believe versus reason to suspect, live nexus between material and the formation of belief that income has escaped assessment, reasons cannot be improved or embellished, reasons based on incorrect information cannot sustain the reopening. I have absolutely no dispute or quarrel against these well settled propositions of law. The question is, how do you apply these well recognized principles by the courts in a situation of this kind? You mentioned that we had the base note came to the department, and I'm not saying to the assessing officer, came to the department. Now, in the base note, I think, Gaurav, what we have not mentioned is that the date of birth and the place of birth of the lady was mentioned. So if you start with the base note, it is in the name of Renu Tharani, and I'm told, I saw through the judgment, the judgment also records that it notes the place of her birth as Pakistan as the date in 1934, somewhere around that time. So I ask myself a question that if I am not associated with a bank account, leave aside ownership for a moment. If I am not associated with a bank account, how does my name, my date of birth, my place of birth feature in that bank account? Clearly, there is some association. I may not be owning the account. Somebody made me a beneficiary in that account. But then I am not duty bound to disclose the person who has made me the beneficiary of that account. At one place I read in the order that it was also said that the trust was settled by the father of the lady. And the father of the lady was the settler. In fact, the order obliquely mentions to that aspect. Now, therefore, the question is that you have this base note and you are in the shoes of the assessing officer. The assessing officer gets this information from the director of investigation saying that there is this assessee in your charge who has a bank account in HSBC Geneva. Now, the use of the expression bank account may, according to you, not be correct. This is only a base note. This is unproved. It is unverified. And therefore, one cannot possibly say that she is the owner of the bank account. Now, having said that, the question that I ask myself for reopening, and the courts have settled this, I think, kind of almost sealed it, that what is required is prima facie belief. Prima facie belief that income of the assessee has escaped assessment. Now, here is a lady the department is in possession of information that she has a foreign bank account, and the foreign bank account, there was no requirement to furnish it in a return of income, but the balance in the account did not tally with the kind of income that she was disclosing. So that gave, let us say, a room for suspicion, that gave a reason to investigate further. And my friend made the point that the assessing officer should have probed further before assuming jurisdiction to reopen. Now, in these kind of matters, I think we are all well aware that these bank accounts in Switzerland or elsewhere are subject to privacy laws. The bank cannot disclose this information to other than either the owner or an authorized signatory who's there in their record. Now, the assessing officer had no way to reach that information as to what is contained in that bank account, who's the owner of the bank account, who's operating the bank account, unless the assessee was to cooperate. So in this kind of scenario where the assessing officer is faced with a stone wall and all his attempts would have been stonewalled at getting that kind of information, he seeks to reopen the assessment and assume jurisdiction. Now, when he seeks to reopen the assessment, obviously before he makes an addition, he gives you all the opportunity to lead evidence to rebut whatever is the allegation, whatever is the contention. So my point would be that in matters of these kinds, where there is no scope or there is no power or locus to the department to investigate the matter any further before seeking to reopen the proceedings, these principles that have been laid down by the courts, and the court said, the Delhi High Court has actually given two contradictory judgments. In one, they said investigation must precede reopening. And the other judgment said that you can make investigation even after you've assumed jurisdiction to reopen. I would take the view that in these kind of matters, the assessing officer would first seek to reopen and then put the onus on you to disprove to the negative. Of course, we'll come to those questions when we deal with the merits of the matter. But I think that one will find it extremely difficult to convince the courts that the assumption of jurisdiction is not proper, having regard to the settled principles with respect to reopening that have been laid down with respect to, let us say, share capital, laid down with respect to loans, but where it is possible for the department to reach the ultimate creditor or to reach the share subscriber. There, the lack of action or the inaction on the part of the department has been viewed adversely to assumption of jurisdiction under section 147. My personal view is this may be viewed differently by the courts. This is where I am coming from.
Yeah, Mr. Vada, please come in.
Thank you. Yes, Ajay, it's an excellent view and I really appreciate. But I will, let's go into the section. See, Income Tax Act is not a punishment proceeding. If the income is not taxable, so be it. It is not taxable, it's not taxable. Whether it is 200 crore or 50,000 crore or whatever the amount may be. Now, there are certain settled principles by the Supreme Court, followed by all across. And there are those general principles. They're not case specific. Those principles don't change based on a case. Now, in what you said, you did mention that the assessing officer had no other way of examination, because obviously you can't get more information than that. Now, that's a presumption. That's what you think. That's what perhaps we would also think. It doesn't come out anywhere that I have nowhere else to go. If you look at the reason to believe, it is very clear. He's very confident that based on the information that I have, I can reopen. And his confidence stems from this. Firstly, he says, I have information from the DIT investigation. There is no reference, Ajay, to the base note. So please let us read this in isolation to the base note that he has. There is no information that it is. Then, now it's a very important part. Secondly, he says he has the bank statement. Admittedly, he doesn't have it. Then he says that he knows that there was a peak credit of 3.97 crores in the bank statement in 2006, 2007. Doesn't know which date it was. What did it represent? Was it in the nature of income or a loan? Well, he could say it's such a big amount. Probably it must be income. So I need to probe whether it's an income or a loan. Then he says that, so this is a second misstatement of fact. So the point that I'm trying to make out is that the material, see, there can be no quarrel, Ajay, on the fact that reasons have to be read on a standalone basis. You cannot supplant or anything. And you can't even infer what somebody else would have inferred. You have to see what a common man with basic knowledge would understand. Now, you have it, firstly, you make a wrong statement of relying on a material which you don't have. The bank statement is a very, very crucial material. So what do you have? Two material. One, the bank statement and the PDIT information. On the PDIT information, we all know, merely by stating that you have information on PDIT is not sufficient, regardless of any case. You have to say what is the information. Then he doesn't say what is the information. He simply says there is a bank account in which the assessee is the owner. Now, so therefore, he doesn't have the bank account, and then he says the assessee is the owner. There's a difference between the trust or the company being the owner than the assessee being the owner. It's a huge difference. If the assessee was the owner in an individual capacity, perhaps one could have said, well, it's such a huge amount. But it's another assessee. It's either the company or the trust. Assessee in the eyes of law with any authority in the world where she is only a beneficiary. If you read the the base note, Ajay, it doesn't even come out that she is the beneficiary. She's one of the 5, 6, 7 people. That's it. And her relationship is of a beneficiary, ownership of a beneficiary. Now, can you say that a beneficiary of a trust stated in the base note, which has companies, which has trustees, which has a settlor, name of a settlor, a director of which she is a beneficiary, can be said to be her bank account? So my point is, these are generic errors which would not lead a mind viewing at it dispassionately to believe that there's an escapement of income. That's the limited point that I'm trying to make.
I think you have analyzed the base note and the accompanying details in substantial depth. But if you look at the order of the tribunal, it is coming at one place that she is the sole discretionary beneficiary. So the second, when you say that the bank account is not available, the balance that is there, the peak balance that is mentioned, and from what little I know, that the stolen information that has come from HSBC Geneva has some photocopies of, you may call it a bank statement, but there are photocopies of, let us say, transactions in what is presumably or supposedly a bank account. So the question is whether at this stage, as the courts have said, and the courts would, according to me, lean to the point that all you need to form is a prima facie belief. You don't have to conclusively prove this is income. Your question whether this is income or this is loan is something that can be gone into at that point of time. At the moment, you have an undeclared bank account. You are not even sure, as you said, that whether it belongs to the assessee or it belongs to somebody else, whether she is a sole beneficiary or she is one of the several beneficiaries, whether it is opened by her, whether she is the settler or not. Now, all those are open. All those are open at the stage of the assessment after jurisdiction is validly assumed. But the question is whether the jurisdiction can be challenged on going by the settled principles of law. And I'm not disputing what you said with regard to the principles laid down by the courts, but equally, if you say that on the investigation information being available to the assessing officer, there are now umpteen judgments which have also upheld the reopening, that where the assessing officer did not do anything more, but took into account the information and sought to reopen the proceedings. There are some judgments which take that view, having regard to, what has come to the judicial notice of the courts of money laundering in the form of share capital formation and so on. So the decisions of the courts are also changing with regard to the realities of the situation, and the settled legal principles are also given a go by at some time. So the point that I'm making is this is not something that can be said to be in black and white, that the reopening would in all cases be quashed in a situation of this kind. And I will only like to add that gross facts make for bad law. As we will see the facts of this case, facts in this case are gross, and there is a cumulative view that has been taken by the tribunal with regard to the overall fact situation in this case. So if facts are different, if facts materially alter, maybe a different conclusion is possible. And that is why the tribunal added the caveat at the end that this decision is rendered on its own peculiar facts. It should not be regarded as a universal precedent.
And let me add one percent. Hello.
Yes. Welcome, sir. Welcome, sir. Please.
See, para 37, if Gaurav, you can put on the screen, that see the base note, Ajay. Base note, just have a look at it. And it is fully extracted in the order of the tribunal. And it begins, this is, in fact, para 38. It begins on 37.
Yes, that's right.
It begins with the name of the person, Renu Tharani, right?
Yes.
It gives her particulars. Then goes on to say the customer's profile, that investment company. Then all those creation of the profile. And then towards the end, you will see beneficial ownership. No, there is no reference to any other entity. It's a Renu, Tharani, and Tharani alone mentioned in this base note. So that, and then it goes on to say that code is Tharani family settlement and all that. So these were the basic facts which were contained in that note. And there was enough material on that basis. One and two, can we see what is the observation? The tribunal very clearly observes that information is not vague or general. Information is about the bank account, which has complete detail. At least a prima facie view can be taken. That's what Mr. Vora was pointing out. And then tribunal also records that this non-resident status was taken, was she shifted to
That comes later, sir. That comes later, sir. On the reason to believe pe issue pe. Sir, with your permission,
yeah,
I will not go through the entire harangue of my argument once again, because Vora Sahab has very balanced way. He has said both. I'll just refer to two things, just one thing. Sir, if the base note was to be relied upon, obviously here the base note has not been relied upon in the reasons to believe. And I repeat, it is the reasons to believe that have to be seen. If the base note was to be relied upon, perhaps the reason should have said like this. They should have said that on the basis of the base note made available to us by the investigation wing, we find that the assessee is an Indian, born in such and such date, has an income of 1,70,000, which he has been reflecting, is said to be a beneficial owner, stroke beneficiary, because it doesn't say beneficial ownership, so of a trust. So my point is to say that you have a bank statement and to say that she's the owner of the bank and to say that this is the peak balance without having any of these documents or without making reference and without supplying these documents at any stage of the proceeding. Question is on the issue of, sir, just I'll close this after this. You had said, I noted, that there is a change in the structure, in the judicial structure. Yes, the judicial thinking is changing. There is also talk of judicial activism. Fine, there is. But will you start to tax people based on arousing passions, based on nationalistic feelings? Would you not stick to the principles? Would you say that because it's an amount of 200 crores, let's say if the amount was only 50 lakhs, would you have said the same thing? Let's look at it ourselves. Let's look into our merely because it is 200 crores, obviously that, yeah, preponderance of probability does come in because of that. Now you are starting, it appears that you have concluded somehow that this amount is unimaginable. Nobody could have earned it. And it is an income. And it is from Cayman Islands. And the bank account has been closed. So now whatever comes, I will give the color of this conclusion to even the reasons to believe. Whereas reasons to believe is a very, very independent document, and that the Supreme Court also in GK Driveshaft has said, reasons to believe, give reasons, seek replies, and only if you are able to respond to the objections, then you proceed. So there are these two stages, and there are two independent stages. Here what it appears is, and that's what we are all arguing, is that we are looking at the merits, getting colored, and then looking at the reasons to believe. In that event, no reason to believe can be defended, sir. That's my point. And I'll leave it at that.
Yes. Yeah. So again, friends, there is a stalemate on the issue of reopening of assessment, while the preponderance of view is tilted towards the revenue, that given the size of the matter and the amount of information available in the base note, the jurisdiction was validly assumed. Now I had one or two questions.
I think Vora wants to say something. Please.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to, Gaurav, before you start on the merits, I think I will react to what Ajay said about the fact that I had already made up my mind and decision to tax this on merits. and then sought to assume jurisdiction under 148. No. My point is that 148 is only a prima facie belief that you've formed, you've reopened proceedings. Now in the reassessment proceedings, you have all the opportunity to lead evidence to rebut that this is not income. Suppose you are a non-resident, you settle this account while you are non-resident, you have substantial income overseas. You could show that, you know, I deposited the monies in this account or somebody else deposited the money in this account out of their known sources of income. So this conclusion was not foregone that this needs to be taxed. I think that has come in with reference to the facts of this case, which we'll discuss in further detail. So I don't think that's the basis to say that the reopening was upheld for that reason.
Right, sir. So should I move on the questions on the merits of the matter?
Yes, I think let Bora Saab have the last word on this issue. And then, of course, we leave it to everybody else to.
Yes, definitely. So I think, sir, on the merits of the matter, multiple issues arise. As to first, my point is whether assessee can be said to have sufficiently discharged the onus placed on him by first placing the affidavit on record, and secondly, the letters. Whether the letters received from the HSBC Bank had good evidentiary value when the department was itself relying upon the base note, whether or not those letters could have also constituted a valid evidence insofar as the status of assessee was concerned, where it was clarified that she was the discretionary beneficiary and not the bank account. So why should those affidavits and the letter should not have been taken on record by the tribunal by deciding this case? So the two questions: first, whether the onus was sufficiently discharged or not, and what was the evidentiary value of both the affidavit and the letter, and then we'll come to consent waiver form, sir. So since we lost Mr. Srivastav last time, so can I ask Mr. Srivastav to answer this first, please?
Yes, sir. Gaurav, I mean, though the order of the tribunal does not state so, but I believe from what has been extracted out of AO's order, possibly this addition is under those sections of 68, 69A or those sections. So the onus will obviously depend on the language implied in those sections. And the primary onus is on the taxpayer in those sections to satisfactorily explain why a certain asset or money or bullion or whatever it is not disclosed in the books of account, and how it is satisfactorily explained. Now, so what the taxpayer did in this case was that it filed letters showing that she is not the owner of the bank account. Question. Now, it was not a question whether she was owning the bank account or not, whether the bank account stood in her name or not, or whether a trust was created in between or some company was created in between, because the structures layering can always be done. Question is whether the money belonged to her or she had that onus, because the finding of fact somewhere is that she is the sole beneficiary of that trust and of that company. And with those findings, if she is the sole beneficiary, then she becomes the owner of the money lying in that bank account. It's not being the beneficiary of because this is layering, this structure is created just for routing this money, and that sufficiently tribunal has dealt with that aspect from the information that was available in the public domain with regard to these bank accounts, that how these bank accounts got opened, how this layering was done, how the money used to pass, and how it got deposited, and how it was managed by the HSBC Bank and its other tributaries. Now, so if that be the case, the question is, that would all depend on the facts, whether that onus was discharged or not. Now, a simple thing. So you cannot keep consent waiver away from this discharge of onus. It's a very much part of that onus. Now, if a simple question, if a simple request is made that you allow us to get the complete information from that bank and other relevant authorities, agencies, wherever that information is, so as to get a complete picture of what has happened in this transaction. And then you do not cooperate with that on the ground that no, you are not the owner of the bank account. Be it, all right. If you are not the owner of the bank account, how does it matter? Your consent will be rejected by the bank if the bank doesn't honor. Let the banks decide whether on the waiver of your consent, could the information about this bank account be fully parted with by them. So if you do not cooperate in allowing the revenue or the investigating agencies to get a complete record, and this information is exclusively in your domain knowledge or in the knowledge of the bank, and the bank is bound by those laws, it won't give the information unless you give your consent. So if that be the position, then how do we say that the onus was completely discharged? And now it was for the department to prove. And again, back to this one question, the department won't get that information. The only way to collect the information is to get the consent waiver. I mean, we are talking of that era when then the treaties were not revisited and not revised on that time when the assessment was made. So today it is different story. I mean, today the authorities can get the information on their own, and there are agreements to that effect, but not those days. That's
so your point is that the assessee could have discharged onus only if...
No, onus is not discharged because you are not offering, explaining, mere saying that the account is not in my name is not enough. When the facts are so stated, when you know that your address and that company's investment company's address is the same in Mumbai. When all those facts are pointed out, that you are the sole beneficiary, and still you say that no, I have nothing to do with that bank, and therefore I'll not sign the consent waiver. So I don't think that you want the explanation to come fully on record, and you don't want that explanation to be really examined by the tax authorities.
No, sir, I think the point was that the letter specifically prescribed her to be the discretionary beneficiary. Even if she was sole beneficiary, was the assumption of fact.
I get
but assuming she was a sole beneficiary, but the main point remains that she is the discretionary beneficiary. So then the Supreme Court decision comes into play, and without distribution, whether that can be added to income.
You start quoting the Supreme Court decision before the facts are gathered and inquired into. I mean, that's not the right way. I mean, that you put Supreme Court decision as a cart before the horse, and you quote the Supreme Court decision and as if not to allow the proceedings to go any further and not to allow the facts to come on the top. That should not be the point. Point is, the law says that if any money or asset, any asset belongs to you, you say it doesn't belong to you. Revenue says, okay, it doesn't belong to you. Give the consent. We will make the inquiries and find out if it doesn't belong to you, fine. But let that fact be inquired. So this is what the revenue says, and you say, now onus keeps on, burden keeps on shifting. So I do say, no, I'll not give that waiver. There, and other aspects of waiver we can come later, but on the point of onus, how can we say that the assessee has fully discharged the onus?
May I call in Mr. Vora for his views on this aspect?
Thank you, Gaurav. As Mr. Srivastava pointed out, in terms of Section 68, the primary onus is on the assessee if any money is found credited in your account to prove the identity of the subscriber, the creditor, the genuineness of the transaction, the creditworthiness, etc. In 69A, the addition can be made if the assessee is found to be the owner of an unexplained investment, unexplained asset, and the assessee does not offer an explanation. Now here, although the initial onus will be on the revenue, now the revenue confronts you with this base note, and which says that we have information that you are the owner of a bank account. So please show cause why this balance in your account should not be added as your income. In that situation, the burden shifts to the assessee. Now the assessee has to prove who have Gaurav time and again been saying that the assessee is described as a discretionary beneficiary in the bank account. At worst, let us assume she is the sole discretionary beneficiary. Now, when you refer to the lady as a discretionary beneficiary, you are presuming that there is a trust in existence of which she is the beneficiary or the sole discretionary beneficiary. The tribunal, the trust deed, the tribunal order records that a draft of the trust deed was placed on record of the assessing officer, not placed on record of the department. So to say that there is a trust in existence which is in the special knowledge of the assessee is a fact which has not been proved by the assessee. So the assessee is saying that I am only a discretionary beneficiary of a so-called trust is something that the assessee needed to prove by placing on record the existence of the trust deed. And then the department would have gone to the settlor and asked the settlor, please prove the sources of making the deposit in this account. And therefore, by not placing the trust deed on record, you have not discharged the onus. You have stonewalled the attempt to reach who, according to you, would have settled the trust. So if the trust deed is not placed on record, if the existence of the trust is not proved, clearly you have not discharged the burden. And as I asked you the question, I, as an assessing officer, would ask the lady, how does your name, your date of birth, your place of birth appear in this account if you say that you have no association with this account? The HSBC bank in Geneva would not have known all these personal details about yourself, and they would not have entered into a particular bank account these specific details. So clearly, while the burden shifts, and it could have shifted back to the revenue if she had proved that she was a non-resident, monies were deposited by her out of her known sources of income while she was overseas, she had earned that money overseas, the owners would have shifted back to the department to prove this is income from undisclosed sources. But clearly on the given facts of this case, according to me, she has not discharged the burden once the burden shifted to her.
So we have one voice from our first two experts. Any contrary view, Mr. Wadhwa, please?
मैं तो contrary दूंगा, क्योंकि I have been paid to do that. Now, एक गौरव, एक जो point है ना, जो आपको एक और discuss करने वाला है, which you have to throw up on the reasons to believe is that it's the reason to believe was on the presumption that the assessee is a resident. Later on, and it's an indisputable fact that she was a non-resident. So the information though came subsequently, whether when it was brought to the notice of the assessing officer, the reasons to believe should have been withdrawn. Because they are two different things. So I think isko bhi ek question lena, but now coming to the material. Vora sahab ne badi baat sahi kahi hai, 69A ke andar accessible hai. Lekin ye jo presumptions hain, ye jo deeming fictions hain, there are two streams of assessees we are talking about. One is the residents and the other stream is the non-residents. Where residents are concerned, their global income is taxable. Where non-residents are concerned, income which accrues or arises in India or is received in India is taxable. Now, if I make a statement, my income has not accrued or arisen in India as a non-resident, then the AO has to prove that it has arisen in India. Because otherwise, what will happen? Non-residents can have bank accounts anywhere in the world. And if you start to ask them, कि तेरे 300 करोड़ रुपए कहां से आए? You cannot. I'm suppose you have no jurisdiction. Unless you establish that those 200 crores are linked with India. वो अभी तक नहीं हुआ. Now, second, खुद ही कह रहे हैं कि 1.5 साल के बाद 200 करोड़ उसके अकाउंट में आया. Let's look at that also. It's not the next day that she's got it, but not again in her account. Now, having said that, 69A here would not be applicable if 69A is being looked at objectively vis-a-vis a non-resident. I'm not coming to circumstantial evidence. If she is taken to be a non-resident, then 69A would not apply unless the assessing officer finds that that income has accrued in India or has been received in India because she's a non-resident. That's my point, number one. Number two, okay, now let's leave that aside. So on that count alone, I think the department has not been able to discharge the burden. It should go. Circumstantial will come later, because on the basis of circumstantial evidence, preponderance of probabilities, all these sections have been given a go by. Right now we are talking of the section per se. So section per se would not apply to a non-resident in the manner it has been applied, because the initial onus is on there. The only thing that they know is that he's a non-resident, she's a non-resident, indubitably a non-resident, and has a bank balance which has a balance. That's all. And that too bank balance outside India, not in India. So 69 doesn't apply unless the AO does something more. That's point number one. Now, the question of the evidence, trust. The base document says it's a trust. The confirmation that the lady got from HSBC says it's a trust. They both say she's a beneficiary. Now, if the base document on the basis of which you have reopened the assessment, the entire edifice of the assessment is the base document, the existence of trust has not been disputed, the tribunal cannot say that I will disregard the existence of the trust and pass an order as if the account belongs to her. Then come on to the next question. I'll give you a hypothetical example. Let us say I, Ajay Vadva, I go abroad and there I have some friends and relatives. It's a year and a half is a long time for me to charm my way through. There are some people who are who have been detected with some serious ailment. They have nobody else. They say, Mr. Vadva, here is 200 crores of which you become a beneficiary. It is possible. But yes, if I was a resident, obviously then I have to explain. But if I'm a non-resident, these things can be possible. It's a possibility. Secondly, don't forget that the confirmation that the assessee brought has not been tested. Confirmation is from HSBC. The AO doesn't say that the confirmation brought from HSBC is a fraudulent document. And the confirmation from HSBC also says that the trust has been dissolved and the money has not gone to the beneficiary, which means it is possible because it's a discretionary trust. In a discretionary trust, there can be a situation where the discretionaries exercising their discretion can even donate the entire money to a third person. The Supreme Court says that in a discretionary trust, you will tax the beneficiary only if the money goes to her. Now the confirmation says it has not gone. The confirmation says it has been dissolved. Now you are saying you sign a document, consent form. Now I am saying, look here, my confirmation says I don't operate the account. It doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to a company. What is the locus standi? Why should I sign something which is not mine? How can I? Now, the account belongs to Ajay Vora. Why should I sign? And there is a privity of some relationship that we have, both of us. I am sworn, let us say, not to even utter a word. Yes, if it's my account, I understand. If the money has come to me, I understand. But again, in the light of being a non-resident. Therefore, what I'm saying is that, and HSBC confirmation, somebody has said that how did she get the HSBC confirmation? She got the HSBC confirmation by writing to the director of the account, who got the confirmation for her. Right? Now, so the point that I'm trying to make, sir, is that preponderance of probabilities has washed all the legal settled principles. Income Tax Act has been given a go by because you felt the evidence, the facts are of such a nature. Oh, 80-year-old lady goes, in a year and a half, she becomes a beneficiary. She has a bank account and it has come through that information, through that man, Snowden. The committee, which is looking into this, have themselves made a distinction between resident accounts and non-resident accounts. Non-resident accounts are not to be touched. 10 cases I've also done. That's the board's. Why are you then doing this here? Have you been able to establish it as an income? So point is, you can put the negative onus on the other person as much as you want, but that's not the way. You have to go by the law. And 1.5 years is now, yes, you could have got a gift. Once I'm abroad, I'm a non-resident, I'm a non-resident. You prove it. No, you have the strength. You have 16 years, you could have examined. You can still examine. Go fight it through. 200 crore की बात है. But ये क्या मतलब हुआ? कि आप सोचे, बस आपके दिमाग में आ गया कि भाई ये तो उस वहां से आया, इधर से आया, केमन आइलैंड के तो सब बदमाशी होती है. मदर टेरेसा तो, see, I am not at all for a moment, not that. But what I'm saying is, ये trend जो है, where passions are aroused, nationalistic feelings are aroused, then you can do anything. You can play harakari with the Income Tax Act. That's the point. I'll stop it at that.
Mr. Vora, your views on the circumstantial evidence that when there is no evidence in the possession of assessing officer, whether circumstantial evidence by going to the newspaper reports, Google report, etc., will that constitute a good evidence to decide the case against assessee?
No, I think Gaurav, let's place circumstantial evidence in the background for a moment. I think we are still on this question of onus. And as my friend said in 69A, the assessee must be found to be the owner of the asset. Now, there is stolen information, and the stolen information suggests that the assessee is the owner of the bank account. Right or wrong, this information is available. And the name in the bank account is Renu Tharani. It is linked to some Tharani Family Trust. It is linked to the related person. The profile name is GWU Investments. But the bank account is in her name. Her date of birth, her place of birth are all given in the bank account. Now, the question is, according to the department, she has been found to be the owner. And in 69A, my friend referred to the fact that you cannot possibly question a non-resident, and she could possibly have in that 1.5 years since she left, between the opening of the bank account and the time she left India, she could have got the money. The account was opened in July 2004. And from the facts that you put up, she left India, I think, a couple of days before the close of financial year.
March 2004, yeah.
She left in March 2004.
Yes.
Okay. So now the issue that arises is the department is only possessed of that information giving the peak balance in assessment year 6-7. Nobody knows the details of the deposits between July 2004 up to financial year 6-7. So we are not going at that. But according to me, 69A talks of any person. It does not make a distinction between resident or non-resident. That's one. Second, yes, the government has issued FAQs in the context of the black money law, where they said that if a non-resident has made deposits, then in that situation, no question should be raised under the Black Money Act. But according to me, under the Income Tax Act, there is no such distinction. And if the assessee, and this in 69A, this is a rebuttable presumption. You have to offer an explanation. So if the assessing officer now confronts you with a situation that we have information that you are the owner of a bank account, and please show cause why the balance in the account should not be added. As Ajay said, and rightly, all principles, the classical principles have been given a go by. You normally tax the year in which the investment is made. You tax if this is your income. But all that in the context of this foreign bank accounts, yes, the courts are kind of diluting and disregarding the settled classical principles with regard to taxation of income when it comes to these kind of undisclosed bank accounts. Now you raise the point about confirmation from HSBC. As I pointed out, you have got the confirmation from HSBC. The further question that is asked you to prove the existence of the trust, you are not able to dislodge that presumption against you. You are not able to lead evidence to discharge the burden that this is in the nature of a trust settled by somebody else, and you are a mere beneficiary who has received no distribution. So in that situation, yes, the principles of HHM, Vikramjit Singh of Gonda would have applied to say that you are a discretionary, you have not seen any money, no money has been distributed to you, and therefore this need not be taxed in your hands. Ultimately go against the settler who's opened the bank account and named you as the beneficiary. Yes, my friend says gift could have come from so many people. He's fortunate that somebody has billed him the 200 crores, which he's not disclosing. But that's a different matter. So you will still be able to require to show who has gifted you the money. Even though you may be a non-resident, you may still have to prove in this kind of a situation where you find yourself in, to dislodge the burden to prove that this is in the nature of a gift received from somebody or a trust settled by somebody else in which you have been described as a discretionary beneficiary. So my submission would be that when you come to circumstantial evidence, the court has not really decided only on circumstantial evidence. The court has first come on the question that have you dislodged or discharged the burden that is cast upon you to show that the monies in this bank account are not beneficially belonging to you. If the trust had been proved, if the settler had been brought on record, If the settler could not have given information or could not have, logically or conclusively proved the sources of his funds, a different conclusion would have followed. Otherwise, what are you saying? You are saying that the assessee earned the income in India. The assessee did not disclose the income for tax purposes in India. The assessee surreptitiously transferred the money overseas, and this money found its way into the bank account in Geneva. In fact, there are two, decisions from that that I need to refer. One is the case of Somdat from the Calcutta Tribunal, where again the existence of the trust was not established, and the amount was taxed. Now, in another case of his brother Brahmdat, which went to the High Court, and that was the case in which that 16-year limitation for reopening assessment was held not applicable in a situation of this kind, where the assessment year was prior to the limitation already expiring. There, the assessee said, I was a non-resident. I settled the trust out of my sources of income, which I earned overseas, and it is for the benefit of myself and my family members. And the High Court took note of the fact that the assessee was a non-resident at the relevant point of time when the trust was opened. So here again, I think the facts that needed to be brought on record to establish that these monies did not belong to the individual were clearly missing. And therefore, according to me, the burden has not been discharged. And therefore, this is a case which, according to me, does not lay down any principle of law, but moves on the basis that the assessee was not able to dislodge the burden cast upon her to prove that the money, that the bank account did not belong to her, or the money in the bank account did not belong to her. And in this process, as Ajay rightly said, all classical tests of photocopies of documents, stolen evidence, all have been disregarded. And you can take it, my friend, that courts today are veering around to this view, that where it is not possible to prove this kind of information, then in that situation, unless the assessee is to cooperate in the inquiry, we would presume the adverse against the assessee. The matters are proceeding on presumption. Yes.
Mr. Srivastav, any closing remarks on this issue?
Gaurav, if I may just
please.
Gaurav, if I may just one point, because Ajay has made an allegation against me, so I have to respond. Now, allegation, of course, I'll respond a little later. Point number one, admittedly, it is stolen information. It is stolen by an ex-employee of HSBC. Stolen information reaches the French authorities, and that information is passed on to India. A stolen information remains stolen. Just because it has come through channels of double taxation avoidance agreement doesn't make it a pristine, clear, verifiable, and correct information. A thief has done it. It may be correct, may not be correct. Who will verify that this stolen information is correct or not? The man from whom this information has been stolen. And who has it been stolen from? HSBC. Now, your might of the entire government is not being able to verify from HSBC whether the information which has come to us is stolen or not. No, HSBC doesn't respond. So this information, and there is a mismatch in the information. You are saying it is her personal account. HSBC saying it's not her personal account. It belongs to a bank. There's a mismatch. So the evidence that you have is no evidence, particularly looked at in the light of a non-resident. Now I'll come to the non-resident point. Now Mr. Vora said that 69A makes no distinction between a resident and a non-resident. I'll respectfully differ. Yes, it does. It starts with the word anybody, any person. But the taxability of income of a resident and non-resident are completely different. If a non-resident has a bank account abroad, 69A cannot be applied because he is bound to have bank accounts. Secondly, 69 would the onus would only come in if the department has irrefutable income evidence that the income has been earned in India. Otherwise, you cannot touch a non-resident. If that's the principle, then there can be no then we can even someday sit and say, Bill Gates, he came to us for 6 months, we tax him if he has an account there outside. That's the point. Next point. So therefore, what I'm saying is, A, information is not credible. with the just because it has come from the French government, it doesn't make it pristine information. 2, residential status is something which has to be, unless you say she's a non-resident, and a year and a half is a long time to make money. And if I made money outside, Mr. Vora, if I do happen to go out and move there for a year and a half, please don't use your skills to question how I got 500 crores. I am a person, I can make 1,000 crores outside India. It has no value for me. You know that. Now also tell me, no, you have made an allegation. Now there is a picture lying at your back. Everybody has been speculating because you have been sitting there in that picture. You yourself have said it has huge value. You yourself said it's a loan. Now just because, therefore you have said, now can I reopen your assessment and so let me verify whether it's a loan or is income? You said that about, I will hold you on to that.
Yeah, but I will not object to the reopening. I will demonstrate by infallible evidence.
So therefore, but reopening nahi. I can do that in regular assessment कि मेरे को material मिल गया, लेकिन material का nexus तो लगाऊं. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. But sir, I would after Srivastava Sahab, Gaurav, come back to that point. That's the very important point on the reopening part.
That would be our last question for the day.
Yeah. So, well, I think Mr. Vora has already addressed the issue in all aspects, except that I need to answer what Ajay says about 69A and its application to a non-resident. See,
Sir, if I may just come in, please clarify which Ajay, because he is taking advantage of this, impression of Mr.
Ajay Vadva, obviously. I am now responding to him because already you have covered that.
Tomorrow it might be quoted that Ajay Vora is in possession of 500 crores. I think Gaurav is making notes clearly. The minute should clearly bring that out. Huh?
So, as already pointed out by Mr. Vora, that 69A doesn't make any distinction between a resident and non-resident, but yes, on the primary principles of cross-border taxation, that income will have to have a certain nexus with India to get taxed. To that extent, the principle is well set. But here is a case of a person who till 7 days before the previous year, that's what Traveller records, that she shifted to US just 7 days before the start of the previous year, right? So just shifting, and now that income, no way she could have earned. This is what Traveller points out in unequivocal terms. So that income was obviously earned in India. It has a nexus with India, and income accrued and derived from India now gets deposited in a foreign bank account. Then 69A would certainly apply. If there is a nexus of that deposit with an Indian income, which in this case, yes, in the absence of any explanation, in the absence of any other material to be led, that yes, that there was some way, if she had given the explanation that, look, I have received this money from X person, which is on capital account, I have earned this money in US or in China or somewhere else, yes, then revenue would have had a very difficult task to disprove her. But that material not being there, her shifting, being a non-resident, being such a short duration, which it makes it impossible for her to earn that income. So that income can reasonably be presumed to have an Indian nexus and can be brought to tax under 69A.
I would just want to, give me that permission.
Please.
When you are saying 69A, I don't think the revenue needs to even prove the nexus with income earned in India.
Yeah.
According to me, once you are not able to discharge the burden of showing that the monies deposited in the account are not income earned in India, the revenue does not have to prove positively that you earned the income.
Ajay, I was being very specific.
I think
for the reason that Vadava would go on crying that every non-resident you call his bank account and examine. So I'm trying to make that narrow down that field of inquiry.
So I think according to me, the legal position would be that the revenue.
The position is all right. Yeah. Even not.
If you claim that you earned this income overseas, I would have said you place on record your income tax return filed in America saying I have earned this much income there. You would have then discharged the burden.
And yeah,
नहीं, because Mr. Vora has interjected, I also have the right to interject.
नहीं, एक
मेरे को दे दो।
complete कर लो, the floor is yours.
नहीं, you are getting weighed down by the weight of Mr. Vora, and you are saying that गलत बात है साहब। मेरे को ये बताइए साहब, मैं खाली एक चीज पूछ रहा हूँ साहब, मेरे को इसका जवाब दे दीजिए बिल्कुल। मैं नॉन रेजिडेंट हूँ, पहली बात आपने कहा मैं 7 दिन बिफोर द स्टार्ट बन गया, वो गलत है फैक्ट। अरे से मैं पूरा साल रहा, क्योंकि गौरव करेक्ट मी, 7th 2004 में गया वो नॉन रेजिडेंट बनी, निकली, उसके बाद पूरा 1 साल रही। असेसमेंट ईयर इज 2006-7। तो ये गलत फैक्ट है कि मैं 7 दिन के बनने के बाद ही मैं नॉन रेजिडेंट बनी। दैट्स अ रॉन्ग फैक्ट। आई वाज देयर अ नॉन रेजिडेंट फॉर मोर देन दैट पीरियड।
अजय, बैंक अकाउंट वाज ओपनड इन 2004।
बैंक अकाउंट कुछ भी हो, आपने टैक्स मुझे 2006 में किया, आपको पता ही नहीं मेरा कितना बैंक अकाउंट है।
Her shifting to US is 7 days before the start of the previous.
Only the bank account opening, sir. Second point, जब एक चीज खाली 69A पे मैं करके छोड़ रहा हूँ।
हाँ।
अगर 69 पे आप थोड़ा लिंकेज का बताइए कि 69, एक सेकंड, अगर मैं नॉन रेजिडेंट हूँ और मेरा आपके पास एलिगेशन ये आती है कि मेरे पास बैंक अकाउंट है HSBC में, आप एज एन इनकम टैक्स डिपार्टमेंट इन इंडिया, कैन यू आस्क मी फॉर ए नॉन रेजिडेंट, आप मुझे बताइए आपके पास पैसे कहाँ से आए, इतना बता दीजिए बस।
पहली बात तो उसके पहले मैं द लीगल क्वेश्चन दैट यू रेज्ड, बिकॉज accrual in India and see section 5(2) is all subject to other provisions of the act. That's the beginning of section 5, subject to the other provisions of the act. These are the income accruing in India, accruing deemed to accrue in India, received in India, and all that. So that is all subject to other. So 69 is not overwritten or overed by section 5, 1. And 2, it would all, any non-resident, if he has come into the tax net of Indian tax authorities, if he has fallen in that net, then he is obligated to the discharge of that bonus under 69 also, 68 also. But if he offers that explanation that look here, this income is earned outside India, then this burden will obviously shift back to the revenue to prove it otherwise. That's as simple as that. So, but you cannot say that simply because it is income, there is a presumption that in the case of every person, every non-resident, the income is earned or accruing outside India and not earned or accrued within India. How can that presumption be drawn? Law doesn't provide for that kind of presumption. That's all.
I think we can leave it that. But this, the last point here है that yes, if I am a non-resident and I have a bank account outside India, the money is deposited outside India, presumption is India, it has not been earned in India. Because अगर मैं non-resident होके ये presumption rebut करूंगा किसी भी country का कि उसकी country में, because I am a citizen of that country, citizenship taxation नहीं है India के अंदर, residential form of taxation है. अगर मैं non-resident अमेरिका में जाता हूँ, साहब आप ये सोचो कि आपका बेटा गया, नहीं आपका बेटा चला गया, आपको उसकी दर्द नहीं है, आपको उसकी थिरानी की, आपका बेटा चला गया, वो बेचारा जाके कमा रहा है, उसने जाके किसी से करके नॉन रेजिडेंट हो गया, उसने 50 करोड़ रुपए वहां कमा लिया, इंडिया कहेगी क्योंकि वो आपका बेटा है और इंडियन रेजिडेंट है, इसलिए बर्डन
आपका प्रपोजिशन अजय, आपका प्रपोजिशन
इतना
ब्रॉड है कि इसका मतलब तो इनकम को हमें किसी तरह बाहर के बैंक अकाउंट
नहीं कर सकते आपके पास नहीं है।
आई एम इम्यून फ्रॉम इंडियन टैक्स।
आप घर बैठ के कर नहीं सकते, आपको आप कैसे प्रिज्यूम कर लेंगे इंडिया में इंडियन
ऐसा कोई प्रपोजिशन मत एडवांस करो
है। दिस इज सेटल्ड, आई विल गिव यू 20 जजमेंट्स ऑन दिस सर। अच्छा, आई विल गिव ओके सर जस्ट सेकंड। सुरेश नंदा, सुप्रीम कोर्ट ऑफ इंडिया की जजमेंट, High Court approved, Supreme Court approves that in the case of a non-resident, if the money is outside India, you have no jurisdiction to tax unless I will give you. Take it just now, Gaurav, just send it. That's the law. अब अगले पे चलते हैं साहब.
So last question for the day, I think that will be to Mr. Wadhwa. Whether reassessment proceedings ought to have been dropped when the notice was issued to the assessee in the capacity of resident, but subsequently she was found to be non-resident. To you, Mr. Wadhwa.
देखिए साहब, मेरा ये कहना है कि अब मैं पिटूंगा, मुझे पता है, but doesn't matter. मैंने असेसिंग ऑफिसर ने रिटर्न खोली, रिटर्न में गलती से या जानबूझ के टिक कर दिया कि मैं रेजिडेंट हूं उस साल का। अब असेसिंग ऑफिसर के पास इंफॉर्मेशन आई, उसने कहा रेजिडेंट हो, तुम्हारा बैंक अकाउंट बाहर है, ये नहीं कि उसमें इनकम इंडिया में या आपने कमाई या नहीं, बैंक अकाउंट बाहर है, आपके पास पैसा है, मैंने आपको टैक्स कर दिया। नाउ subsequently when the reasons to believe come, you say, sorry, I am a non-resident and here is the evidence. Passport diya, it clearly comes out that the person is a non-resident. Now again, I am maintaining that in order to tax a non-resident, reopen the assessment of a non-resident, you have to establish that the income accrued or arose in India. Merely because a non-resident, you can't reopen the account of any non-resident simply because the money is found in a bank account outside India. So if the assessing officer was in the possession of the evidence that she was a non-resident, this reopening could not have stood the test of the scrutiny by the courts. It could not have, because it merely states you have an account. It merely states the obvious that yes, you are a non-resident, you have an account outside India, therefore obviously you can't tax me. Now that information came though subsequently, but it was an information which goes into the very jurisdiction of the very concept of income, and therefore the reopening should have been dropped and fresh notice should have been issued based on the information that she's a non-resident. Now, I'll just give 2-3 examples. If, let us say, there is a mistake in my return, and the mistake in the return shows that the mistake is mistakenly I said it's 100 crores, but somewhere it comes out it's only a crore. The assessment is reopened, and I immediately in the first instance go and say, sorry, it was a mistake, it's a crore. Now, would you say, no, the reopening is fine, and I will go through the entire drill of merits and then pass an order only on merits? Yes, you will say no. Yes, it's the fact, it was a mistake. Because for every mistake, if the reopening is held to be valid, it will be harakari. Another situation. Let us say, by mistake, I say, it's the return of an assessee who has died subsequently and not intimated. Nobody has intimated his death. Reopening of a dead person takes place. It is brought to his knowledge, the legal heirs, that the man is dead. Now, will that notice survive? Definitely not. There is a High Court judgment, Supreme Court. It will not. You can't have a notice against death person. So next notice will have to come, will have to be in the name of the legal heirs. Similarly, in the case of a company which has amalgamated, mistakenly I mentioned the name of the company. Notice is served. Supreme Court now says, if the company is not existing, amalgamated, you need not have informed. The fact is it doesn't exist. So notice is bad. Now what I'm saying is, when something of this nature is brought to the notice at the reopening stage, and you are supposed to pass an order showing application of might, this is something which should have been taken cognizance of, and the reopening should have been withdrawn. That's the point.
Mr. Vora, any remarks, your remarks on this issue?
I think what my friend is advocating is the lawyer wins, the client is dead. He's suggesting that the proceeding should have been dropped and fresh notice should have been issued. Limitation was still available. It is still available today in 16 years to reopen the proceeding. That's one. Second, I think the assessee would have been unfortunate if this would have been dropped and the revenue would have proceeded under the black money law. Maybe greater misfortune would have befallen the assessee. So I don't think I am advocating or supporting or endorsing what was said, that merely because the reopening was on the basis that the lady is a resident, but it transpired that she was a non-resident. The fact of the matter is the status doesn't matter. In a matter of this kind, I'm not making a generalization. The status does not matter because ultimately you have to show that this monies in the account did not have nexus with India. They were not earned in India. They were not liable to tax in India. So, assuming you are a non-resident and there is a reassessment notice against you, what would you do? You would prove that the monies were not liable to tax in India and were therefore not disclosed for tax in India, tax purpose in India, and hence do not constitute undisclosed income. You have had notices given to foreign companies who have not filed tax returns in India because the income was subject to tax withholding. The amount of tax withheld was the final tax payable on that kind of income. Ultimately, the company came forward before the High Court, explained that on this income tax has already been deducted. This is the final tax liability, and the court then quashed the reassessment, not on the basis that the notice was issued to a non-resident, and therefore merely on that basis the reopening should have been quashed. So I don't think courts today are, going on these technicalities. And today what you need to look at is where it is substantial justice pitted versus technical rules of evidence or technicalities. The courts always lean towards, again, doing substantial justice between the parties. And they will seek to safeguard the revenue's interest in matters of this kind. I am therefore giving you the practical view of what will ultimately transpire in the court, given the current judicial thinking.
I know the answer of Mr. Srivastav, but I think let's have his closing remarks also on this.
I think Mr. Devora has very aptly summed it up, and I don't need to add anything further.
Right. Right, friends, I think we have had an interesting debate. Mr. Vadhva, I think, fought two experts on the other side. And
Gaurav, you not dealt with the consent waiver. I thought 5 minutes you could spend on the consent waiver.
Okay, all right. I think it came out in the mix of discussion, but yes, we can have it as a separate query. So maybe, sir, over to you. I think you can deal with the consent waiver aspect.
So see, basically my point is that, again, as part of the discharging of onus, the assessee could have signed the consent waiver form. You are claiming that the assessee had no locus. The assessee was not in a position to sign the consent waiver form. And as Mr. Srivastav said, that assuming you did not have the necessary locus standi to sign the consent waiver form, the bank would have rejected your credentials and said, sorry, we cannot supply this information on the basis of your consent waiver form, which would have proved that you are neither the owner nor the authorized signatory of the account. Somebody else is obliged and authorized to operate.
I think network issue at his end.
The basis that the assessee declined to sign the consent waiver form and did not allow, and importantly, did not allow the assessee to withdraw the writ petition. They dismissed the writ petition against the quashing of the reassessment proceedings. In the case of Sanjay Dalmia, right up to the Supreme Court, penalty under section 271(1)(b) has been upheld for non-signing of the consent waiver form, which demonstrates how the courts are viewing this. So the consent waiver form, if you had signed, and as we said, the revenue does not have the locus or even the wherewithal to collect this information. So therefore, signing of the consent waiver form in these circumstances would help dislodge the burden one way or the other. It would have helped the department get to the root of the matter. And having said that, I think the only point that I want to make is that if, let us say, you are an accused in some proceedings and prosecution has already started against you, you may then claim the immunity under Article 23 of the Constitution to say that I cannot sign the consent waiver form because that would be self-incrimination. Only in that situation can you say that I seek immunity and I am not in a position to sign the consent waiver form. Otherwise, non-signing of the consent waiver form is seen as a circumstance adverse and goes to show that you have not been able to rebut the evidence against you or to rebut the presumption against you. So it is in that light that the courts have viewed the non-signing of the consent waiver form as a circumstance adverse to the assessee.
Yeah, I'll just make one point, Gaurav, with your permission.
Yeah, please.
You see, the consent waiver form is a document which is to be signed. If you go into the genesis, I wish that these facts had been brought out. There is a report by the committee which was constituted, headed by a judge of the Supreme Court, Ajit Parsayat. It's in the public domain, you can see it. They have classified these cases as actionable and non-actionable cases. And they very clearly said that non-resident cases are non-actionable. When they say non-resident, and forget the circumstantial evidence and the preponderance of probability, there are non-actionable cases. and they have dropped those non-actionable cases. This case was brought up because the assessee wrongly mentioned herself to be a resident, whereas she was a non-resident. Perhaps if she had an HSBC account and she had mentioned that she was a non-resident, this case may have been termed as a non-actionable case and may not even have been put. But that's it's a conjectural issue. Having said that, they understood the law that when it comes to a non-resident, this law would not apply because you will have to do something more. Merely because I can't go any further. I can't make a roving inquiry. Even if today, Gaurav, if you want information from any authority about anybody, you have to establish to that authority that we are doing it because we have evidence that income has escaped. You cannot simply say we want the bank account. They'll never give it to you. You can't simply say it has 200 crores, I'll give it to you. No. Under the double taxation avoidance agreement, Mr. Vora would know, there has to be a very positive evidence, information on escapement of income. Only then you are allowed to do that. Therefore, the law is crying from every angle and saying no, no, no. In the case of a non-resident, if you have a bank account outside India, unless you have evidence, you cannot bring it to tax that it is earned in India. You cannot, because that's the law. Forget that. And that's the law settled by the Honorable Supreme Court in the case of Suresh Nanda. Kindly refer to that High Court judgment. It is settled in as many words as I have said. Now the point is, it is not my account. I have got you a confirmation from HSBC saying it's not my account. It's not being operated by me, it's being operated by the director. You still want me to sign a consent form? You say, no, you should come, you should be honest. But I should be honest about what? Myself. I am saying this, you disprove. No, I can't disprove. I can't disprove because I have no access to go to HSBC.
Ajay, let me be the devil's advocate. Let me then ask you, how does your name appear in that account? How does your date of birth, your place of birth appear in that account?
That is because she was asked, they were asked. The question was, if you look at, you should look the whole thing from the beginning to the end. Your name comes as a beneficiary. The information that she brought in was, firstly, the confirmation was, the confirmation was that you do not have a personal account. The confirmation was that you have never had a personal account for the last 10 years. The confirmation was that you have never signed as a beneficiary in this account. It's on that basis that the name. It was her name and her date of birth was in the context of her being a beneficiary.
No, so therefore, no, when you assume her to be the beneficiary, there must be a trust in existence, no? The existence of the trust is not proved. That is what the tribunal has said. She could have been the second.
No, trust, Ajay, trust is the base note itself says it's a trust on the basis of which you have started.
Where is the document evidencing the trust? That is clearly missing.
I've given you a copy.
No.
The bank is also saying that.
No, bank, there's no copy on record. No, there's no copy.
I would say,
the tribunal record, there is no copy.
They gave a photocopy. They said we won't. No, the unsigned copy. Anyway, that's only what I'm saying. Let's go on the principle. See, of course, point is that we have to. We both have to. I mean, there can be no agreement on this issue. But my only thought, which I have just put in, is consent form was to be signed by people whose cases were actionable.
I don't think this is
I rest my case. पर अजय हो गया अजय करो भाई अनम्यूट करो
we mute
अरे यार ये तो हमारा
I think network issue है. Maybe we can have final words from Mr. Srivastav on this consent waiver form.
And पहले सर मजा आ गया. I think it's been a learning for me with both these stalwarts and giants. One giant from the department, the other giant of the profession. I have just tried to just put up a case and based on the law as I understand. We can all choose to disagree, no problem.
Consent waiver, what are you waiving? It is waiving just your protection from the banking secrecy law. That's all. You have a protection from bank secrecy law, which you are called upon to waive. Now, that's all. Nothing else. Nothing adverse. No adverse inference. Nothing of this kind. So, if you say, I want to enjoy that protection of secrecy law, but you go on. You go ahead It's you just. That is where, and now tribunal has not pointed out, but AO has quoted, I believe, that part has been quoted by the tribunal, where they have relied on section 114 of the Evidence Act and all that. But let us not enter into those arguments. The final word is that yes, the merits of this decision will be tested in the courts, right? Obviously, if the decision is wrong, it will be reversed. That's what we all hope. That's all. But the question is that in our discussions, we should be in a position to appreciate things more objectively and try to appreciate not on technicalities, but in the realm of that what justice would call it to be. Anyway, thank you. Thank you very much.
Should we close, Ajay? Any other point? Any panelists want to address any other point?
Just, Gaurav, I would just like to add a word of caution. In fact, I was sharing, if you can call it a virtual dais, with a senior official from the revenue, and he mentioned that this judgment on onus would be used by the department even in the context of invocation of double tax treaties. So you can imagine the kind of paradigm shift in the thinking of the department itself with regard to these vexed questions. So I would tend to take the view that this is not going to be a cakewalk for assessees or practitioners, howsoever passionate like my friend Ajay Wadhwa. It will be a difficult time in the courts to establish that the reopening was not justified or the addition was not justified. You will need to bring in substantial evidence to dislodge the burden, and ultimately it's a question of the shifting onus and ultimately whether the assessee or the revenue is able to discharge that burden.
That kind of approach, I believe, is unfortunate. I mean, that should not.
I understand.
So yes,
Ranjan,
friends, it was scintillating. I would say it was Ajay versus Ajay, one indefeatable with another indefeatable.
So versus, it was just a debate, healthy debate where so much came out. So we all learned so many things.
With Mr. Srivastav in between. So I think largely, I think the decision seems to be correct. It is based on its facts. We cannot generalize it. But several important principles, as Mr. Vora rightly concluded at the end, that yes, this decision would lay down important principles on the tests of onus, which will be weighed upon in the subsequent litigation time and again. So with this, I would give it back to the officials of the executive committee to close the proceedings of the day.
Ranjan, are you there?
Yeah.
Yes, Ranjan is there. Yeah.
So thank you, friends, for a fiery meeting. First of all, thanks to Gaurav Jain for giving a real insight into the Renu Tharani's case. Then to Shri G.C. Srivastav, he was making a balancing act because on the eve of Janmashtami, about 30-35 years back when we were in school, वो एक रामायण serial आता था तीरन पे तीर चले. It was AV versus AW, and luckily, by God's grace, both were not face to face. They were only on webinar. नहीं तो शायद बात बढ़ जाती और लगता है हमें कोई ट्रस्ट बनानी यहीं पड़ जाते. But in the end, I can just conclude, in my humble view, that in case we see from reopening, the verdict goes in favor of the SSC, but in case of merits, it may go against the SSC. But Gaurav, in case you just take us to page 20, para 28, regarding consent waiver, whether I think the SSC had offered to the CAT appeal, it was not taken on record. Do you have the order in front of you, brother?
Yes.
Just see para 28, page 20.
Should I display the screen? Should I display it on the screen?
No. You can just tell whether it was offered or not.
Para 28.
Para 28, page 20.
No, I think it is not coming out from that paragraph.
Possibly I have noted wrongly.
Sure.
I can just say, not to take much of time, it was an excellent webinar, and thanks to all the participants on this gazetted holiday and on this Janmashtami day, We had an excellent seminar. Thank you once again. And
Thank
have and
Thank you,
Prashad.
Ganesh ji. Thank you, Gaurav. And thank you, Srivastava, so much, so very much.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everybody. Pleasure.
All the best.
Okay.